Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to the show, please smash the subscribe button. Also consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate small amounts given in the link in the description box. But the least you could do is to watch this show, like, share, and comment. Without further ado, let me welcome our guest tonight, Jostein Hauge. Jostein is a political economist whose work focuses on industrial policy, technological change, and economic development. He is currently a lecturer at the University of Cambridge Center of Development Studies and has written extensively on how globalization, digital technologies, and industrial policies shape economic trajectories. His research often challenges neoliberal assumptions, bringing attention back to the role of the state in shaping development outcomes. Professor Hauge, welcome to India and Global Left.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
I want to focus on industrial policies, given so much of the global economic disruption is through the trade and tariff wars. And it has, of course, it has several dimensions, but one of it is about the industrial policies in the global north. You have written about the EU and the United States, saying that there has been a comeback or resurgence of focus in industrial policies, maybe away from neoliberal policies, if not entirely, but in part. So if we could start by having your thoughts on how would you describe the rise of industrial policies in the global north?
Yeah, so let's start with neoliberalism maybe, because that's also a core part of understanding what's happening here. So, in some ways, some talk about the death of neoliberalism here, and I would argue that it's simply been changing form. If you look at the wave of neoliberalism that started in the 1980s, a lot of it was about making the conditions right for capital accumulation and for wealth increases for the ruling classes, especially in the global north. And at that time, the rhetoric behind that was to liberalize trade, to make capital more free and to insert capital into global south countries on the conditions, of course, of the ruling classes in the global north. So neoliberalism, and here I follow very much Quinn Slobodin's view of this, was very much a sort of a set of deliberate policies that was about protecting interests of the rich, especially in the global north. Now, what we're seeing now is sort of a pushback against free trade, but I would still say that this is very much aligned still with protecting the interests of capital in the global north. So in that sense, and if we understand neoliberalism like that, we still live in an era of where neoliberalism is still going strong, but has changed form. Now let's go back to specifically talking about this wave of industrial policy, to some degree economic nationalism that we're seeing in wealthy countries. So particularly since the 2010s, we've seen a resurgence of industrial policy worldwide, but especially in wealthy countries. Now, what's causing this? There are many factors at play here. To some degree, it's the resurgence of the state as a response to the 2008-09 crisis, but there are other more important factors at play. I think the COVID pandemic played a huge part here. During the pandemic, a lot of countries became aware of the dangers of being too dependent on imports of inputs and too dependent on this globalization that we saw building up for many decades. So there's been a push among many national economies to strengthen supply chains, to reshore, and to use industrial policy to build up more production capacity at home, seeing how globalization is fragile. And that's what the pandemic proved to us. Another really important factor at play here in terms of explaining the resurgence of industrial policy in wealthy countries is the rise of China. Especially if you look at the United States today, its trade policy, its industrial policy is very much crafted as a response to China's rise, to meet China's competition, right? A lot of the trade and industrial policy that we've seen in Trump 1.0 and then Biden and now Trump 2.0 is specifically targeted at limiting exports to China, at putting tariffs on China. So in the US, to some degree in the EU as well, but when we look at the United States, you know, the most powerful, wealthy economy in the world, this turn towards economic nationalism and industrial policy is to try and meet competition from China.
There has been talks about or debates about to what degree the West can industrialize given the existence of massive difference in labor prices. And a lot of economists, the business class, etc., would argue that of course, the United States or large parts of the EU won't be able to produce leather goods or textiles, etc., etc. And they say that even to the extent this is a race for industrialization, it is mostly about high tech, and if at all we go beyond that, it would be mostly robots and AI, and not necessarily raising the share of employment through industrial share. I'm curious, given you have looked at industrial policies so extensively, what do you think is a viable industrial policy for the global north at this moment in history, given we have large parts of the global south still reeling under underemployment, locked in agriculture, etc., etc.?
Well, so let's talk about this from the perspective of wealthy countries in the global north, and I'm very interested in getting to the global south, which is more of a primary concern for me. But yes, can the global north reindustrialize? Is it feasible to craft industrial policies that aim to bring manufacturing back, so to speak, to the global north? This is a tricky question because, well, the short answer, in my view, is that bringing back jobs or having a manufacturing sector that employs a huge share of the workforce in the global north is not feasible. Already, we're seeing that the manufacturing sector in countries like Germany, the US, Switzerland, countries with strong manufacturing sector has been and become capital intensive and over time more and more automated. So if you know the goal of creating an industrial policy to bring back manufacturing jobs from, say, China, you know, that's not going to happen for various reasons, but obviously labor costs is one. Wealthy nations simply can't compete with poorer nations on labor costs. But we need to understand here that building up a manufacturing ecosystem is much more than simply having tons of people working in factories. For example, Apple, the company that makes most of the world's smartphones, or the most powerful company in terms of making smartphones, they actually don't have any factories. So how are they a manufacturing company? Well, they outsource all their operations, but they also do things like research and development and industrial design that is production related. And this is a point that a lot of economists miss out on. America, for example, still has a very strong manufacturing sector in these production related services like industrial design, like research and development, because you know, manufacturing should be seen as an ecosystem and not simply people working in factories doing assembly work or putting together things or making things in the factory. So it is perfectly viable from the perspective of the global north and wealthy nations to craft an industrial policy that builds up a production ecosystem that is high tech, but this is not going to be highly labor intensive.
One final question on the global north, and I'm also interested in discussing the global south more extensively. I've been thinking about Germany's industrialization ever since we discussed Wolfgang Munchau's book called The Kaput. And one of the key points he makes is that Germany it still remains over-industrialized, and particularly he argues that it has been over reliant on traditional types of industries, by which he means automobiles, petrochemicals, etc., etc. Um, and he argues that this has basically stifled the development of innovation, because he links innovation to the presence of a quote unquote dynamic capital markets, essentially the VC firms, he says. And he says that in the long run, the United States is winning when compared to Germany, which has remained much over industrialized. And he recommends uh, pulling back of German industry in favor of switching more to service sectors. Now, at a time when things like enormous balanced budgets, etc., and of course, global transformations has caused to a stagnancy of wages in the global north. What does it mean for countries like Germany or other parts of Europe, which still relies on industry, to pull back industry? I'm curious about your response to this set of arguments.
Yeah. While I would agree that in some ways the United States has become more innovative than Germany, um, I don't see a relationship between building up industry and neglecting innovation. I simply think that Germany and the United States have built two different paths. Germany is more focused on heavy industry and I guess more traditional industry, whereas the US has moved towards innovating in other areas. And to some degree, they've also been, I would say the United States have been a bit more attuned to the industries of the future. Um, Semiconductors is a good example. Here we're talking about, chips. They're manufactured products, so we're very much talking about, building up capabilities within chip making as industrialization, and this is something that the United States has done have had capabilities in doing for decades. And not, that's how Silicon Valley built up, and a lot of the innovative activities that happen in Silicon Valley was also related to the hardware that was developed in Silicon Valley. So I don't think if we look at Germany and if we reach the conclusion that the United States has been able to innovate more in certain sectors, that is not it's not, they also industrialized and they also had a lot of industry. I think it's simply more a problem of how innovation happens and uh, targeting targeting the right and the specific sectors and having successful industrial policy that is innovation oriented. That being said, it's not like the United States is a perfect example of a country that is able to identify the industries of the future. If we look at clean energy, both Europe and the United States now is falling behind China, and the United States at present is actually pulling back investments in clean energy production, and China is surging ahead when it comes to batteries, when it comes to electric vehicles, and Germany is also falling behind there, and China is surging ahead when it comes to solar and wind.
Let's come to China maybe, and then I want to move to the rest of the global south, because I found it helpful in your work that you kind of make a distinction between China and the rest of the global south at various points. And this is something we have been arguing from this platform, but also economists like Jostein Hauge and others have been saying that in many regards, yes, China still has a large population within its national economy that is at par with the rest of the global south. But overall, China's dynamics of the economy has moved far beyond what the constraints of that global south faces. We can think about current account deficits and as opposed to current account surplus in China. We can think about technological accessibility. We can think about the science and technology, labor productivity, the presence of finance, for instance. We can go on and on, but the constraints in the rest of the global south and China are very different by now. But that said, I want to have your response about how you look at the past 2.5 decades or so since China joined the WTO, and its enormous rise overall by placing industry at the center of its economy. As someone who looks at industrial policy, how would you make an assessment about its industrial policy as a strategy of economic development, and how would you think uh, is the future of industrial policy in China?
China's rise economically has been absolutely remarkable, and there's really, at this point, there's very little question about this. Um, it's like we're seeing some kind of breakthrough every month right now in a certain sector in China in terms of innovation and development. Um, they, we obviously shouldn't. We should be nuanced and accurate about what characterizes China's rise. And, U.S. transnational corporations still have immense structural power in the global economy. It's still Chinese workers in supply chains working for U.S. companies more than the other way around. But to see a country that was one of the world's poorest nations in the 1970s uh, to go to being at the forefront of innovation and dominating many global industries just 50 years later, it's quite remarkable. We're seeing this especially in across all manufacturing sectors. As I mentioned, in clean energy production, China has at this point is the world's leading nation. They're building up domestic supply chains in advanced semiconductors as we speak, and then of course in a lot of traditional manufacturing industries have built up capabilities for a while. And this is really a testament to the power of industrial policy. Some people talk about markets and liberalization being important for China's economic development. Sure, China liberalized its economy 80s, 90s, 2000s. They entered into WTO membership around the year 2000, and this embrace, if you will, of international trade in some ways has helped China's economic development. They've reached consumer market. They've been able to attract foreign direct investment. But we've seen many countries follow this kind of path of liberalization in the 80s, in the 90s across the global south, which hasn't yielded the same results as that of China. So why did it work for
or
China?
or is facing balance of payment crisis?
Balance of payments crisis, yeah, I mean, yielding the same results is an understatement. For many countries, liberalization was disastrous. I've studied especially the liberalization period in many countries in Africa following the structural adjustment programs where GDP growth was negative following liberalization. But in China, you had a state, or you could say that you had a state that actively controlled this liberalization, and China basically liberalized on its own terms. State-owned enterprises were extremely important in terms of forming joint ventures with foreign multinationals. The state has controlled the financial sector and still does throughout the liberalization period. So it's wrong to view, I think, liberalization as the key element to China's success, but we need to look at it as a system whereby the state governs the market and market mechanisms, in my view.
And what would be the features of state capacity, if you like, that would make China stand apart? I mean, you have mentioned about China's ability to control the financial markets, for instance, or stabilize its currency, or how it controls the banking and finance by, yeah, not absolute ownership, but by majorly controlling the four of the big five, as it is called, enormous flexibility in terms of setting up benchmark lending rates or deposit rates. So effectively gives them a whole range of scopes to indirectly tax, what many economists have called as indirectly taxing households, to what they call would be repressing consumption, etc., etc. Or some would talk about investment in education, particularly throughout the 90s and the 2000s in science and technologies and higher educations. Infrastructure is another key. As someone who looks at state capacity, and this is something I think would lend us to our discussion about the global south, because much of the decolonial period in the global south has been centered around how to build state capacity at a time when there is an enormous shortage of capital, shortage of finance, etc. What aspects of state capacity in China would you say strike you as the most fundamental?
I think you actually mentioned quite a few of the most important ones right now. So I think your summary was very, very useful. You talked about state-owned enterprises, you talked about huge infrastructure investment, and as we're seeing now, for example, in many countries in Africa, the lack of stable electricity supply and other infrastructure-related bottlenecks are a huge challenge for economic development and industrialization. You mentioned education. Um, you know, there's one, in addition to your very useful summary of the conditions that have been important for China's rise, one extra element that I can mention is the development of an elite bureaucracy. That's very important. And that's something we've seen in many of these successful so-called developmental states in East Asia. Before China, you had Korea that, was an example of a very impressive economic success story that rose from poor to rich in a span of 35 years. Singapore as well. And there's been this literature that's emerged based on these success stories that these were developmental states that were characterized by elite bureaucracies that were embedded in the private sector, but detached from the private sector and also detached from everyday politics. This is something I think, especially more people outside of China need to understand, that there's been a long, long, long process of developing an elite bureaucracy that's also very meritocratic, that's been able to eliminate, I think, the most important forms of corruption, although corruption has been part of China's development process throughout. So that's an important element I would add. But obviously, this discussion on the conditions for success for economic development to happen is a huge, huge discussion. That is really the million-dollar question of development, and I won't pretend to be able to summarize it, in one sentence.
You've mentioned about South Korea. Of course, if I'm not mistaken, your PhD advisor, was Professor Ha-Joon Chang, who looks at South Korea and large parts of East Asia. I've been thinking about this contrast within the global South. I mean, of course, most of these countries are no longer global South, but they used to be. Um, I if one looks at the indicators, even when a lot of the global south tried to follow similar strategies like East Asia, it is very striking that East Asian countries stood out from the rest of the global south. Now, of course, as long as it was South Korea, Taiwan, one could argue that it was part of the Cold War strategy, because they also got an enormous amount of investments. They got US markets, etc., etc. So part of it goes to that. Um, but with China in that mix, I'm curious. Some people also talk about the overall stronger capital stock in East Asia compared to parts of South Asia, which has a smaller per capita capital stock with respect to its population, and also Africa and other parts of global South. I wonder what your thoughts are about why East Asia has been able to create that dynamism through a combination of market and developmental state, while large parts of Africa, South Asia, despite making similar efforts, despite having a bureaucracy, despite having stable states, not everywhere in Africa, but I'm thinking about India, for instance, which has had a stable state, has had a bureaucracy, have still struggled to provide that conducive atmosphere for industrialization.
Yeah, I I do think we need to talk about these development experience somewhat on a case-by-case basis. And you did raise an interesting, an important point on the geopolitics of it all. So if we look at, for example, South Korea's development trajectory, of course, what the state did was important, uh, and the impressive industrial policies that were crafted and the elite bureaucracy and so on. But South Korea's strategic position during the Cold War, allied with the United States, also enabled this development period. They received a lot of aid and other important transfers from the United States. Um, and the same could be said of Taiwan as well. So, this makes actually China's rise quite impressive because it is an example of sovereign development from the south that challenges the north, where you actually have forces from the north working against somewhat China. Sure, there was investment from the United States for a long time. That's why this period ahead is going to be very interesting, because now the US is kind of throwing all kinds of things they have in the toolbox at China in an attempt to try and suppress China's development. And this is actually quite explicit if you look at the rhetoric in DC and across political party lines in the United States. There's a lot of work being done right now to try and prevent China from developing its economy. So this makes it more impressive. But why did China, for example, manage to develop and India didn't? Um, well, again, there are many, many factors here that are historically contingent as well. But, I return here to industrial policy and the importance of industrial policy. While there has been periods of, an attempts of industrial policy in India, China, if you look at back to the 1980s when China and India's per capita income were not too far away from each other, China prioritized more heavily building up a manufacturing industry than India did. And India has gone through a route of service led development. And if you know my work, I also stress that, services can be, can lead you to a certain point in terms of development, but there are limitations in terms of how much services can yield for productivity growth, for job creation, for innovation, and so on. Um, and there are cities like Hyderabad, where my wife is from, actually in India, and Bangalore, where there are pockets of extremely high productive services. Um, but I do think this going back to having a well-crafted and long-term strategy for industrial policy that looks at how to develop manufacturing industry is very important for the process of development.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And if I could add that even when India opened up to the rest of the world in the 90s for investments, a lot of foreign investments that came through, I mean, some FDI, of course, not to the scale of China, but it did get a substantial FDI in the 90s and the 2000s. Much of it was coming from the West, and it was linked to the service sector because a lot of it was coming from uh, people of Indian origin establishing themselves in Silicon Valley. If you look at the FDI in China in the 90s, roughly my calculation was one third of it was coming from the West, 10 to 12% from EU, rest from the US, but a massive amount, maybe even about two-thirds, came from the rest of East Asia. Japan, South Korea, Taiwan was offshoring a lot. And these were places where businesses had deep histories and contact experience with manufacturing. And so a lot of them went into manufacturing, and that also explains why China had a different trajectory. Of course, the 80s were significant because Chinese uh, focus at that period of time was the TVE, the Towns and Village Enterprises, which linked up with the state-owned enterprises. Well, in India, the political class was talking about computers and IT and so on, influenced by the United States. Uh,
Another important point while we're on this subject is the vision that China has had for sovereign development. So if you look at, for example, some people highlight export processing zones and special economic zones as key for China's industrialization. And I agree with that. But these special economic zones and export processing zones are not a feature unique to China. We've seen them in many other countries in the global south. But when China set these up, they had a vision for how for how technology were to be transferred from foreign firms to the domestic economy. They had a very strong idea of how much control the China should have and the Chinese state and the state-owned enterprises should have. In many other parts of the global south, we've seen, in South America, also in Mexico, for example, during its liberalization period, which wasn't very successful in the 1990s, we saw these enclave economies being set up and, export processing zones and special economic zones carrying out activities purely on the whims and also the preferences of transnational corporations from the north. And this is China proves a very, very important point. If you want to achieve development and sovereign development, you need to be able to not only do things on the terms of, transnational corporations or foreign investors or the wealthy nations, you ultimately need to challenge them. And otherwise, you're going to sort of get stuck in this so-called middle income trap. You can grow to some degree, but you'll stagnate after some time unless you actually develop the capacity to have innovation domestically and embark on sovereign development.
Yeah, that's a very important point. I guess a lot of people miss out on the special economic zones that China used them as a bargain to extract technology with these foreign multinational corporations. Many economists look at them in the larger chain of global special economic zones, and they look at it sometimes too much from the labor perspective and think that, oh, this is just capitalism, this is a surplus extraction. But I think there is this key element of China using them, of course, as opportunity to bring underemployed labor in the agriculture to industry, but also on the other side of it is to use them as a bargaining chip to set up joint ventures and technological transfers, etc. Okay, let's pivot to the rest of the global south maybe. And one of the things with China is its size. And that's also sets it apart from a Japan or a South Korea or a Taiwan, because it doesn't evacuate the lower value chain the way the rest of the earlier industrial economies did, because it has a hinterland. And so China produces a lot of biotechnology, nuclear technology, aerospace, AI, but China also produces a lot of footwear and leather goods and toys and textile. And this has huge implications on the rest of the global south. And this is something a lot of platforms, especially platforms like us, who has a tremendous solidarity with China, partly because of the admiration we have about its progress in human development, but partly also because its rise has come without imperialism and without national domination. We don't make this distinction sometimes that China's rise has a cost for the rest of the global south. Of course, there is a lot of exaggeration about this imbalance in the global north, but in the global south, there are talks about this. So I'm curious, in many ways, in the last 2.5 decades, with the rise of China's industrial share of the overall global share, of course, it has come at the cost of the global north, which may not be necessarily bad, but it has also come at the expense of the rest of the global south to some extent. Um, Under such circumstance, of course, you have written about the connector states like Mexico and Vietnam and Malaysia and Indonesia, which have been able to navigate this trade wars or economic warfares to get investments, to get new markets, etc., etc. Uh, but also a lot of other countries are facing a lot of other problems. So if you could tell us a little bit about these differences within the global south, how places like Vietnam, Indonesia, or Mexico have been able to benefit from this kind of tensions about industrial superpower, and how a lot of other countries in Africa, in South Asia, for instance, haven't been able to, or have been negatively affected by all these disruptions. I think that would interest our viewers.
My sentiments are very similar to yours, and I actually think the way you talk about China's rise with nuance capture things really well. So I'll try to elaborate on some of the points you raised, but maybe I'll also simply repeat them. Um, so I think, as you said, there is reason for those of us with an internationalist perspective and a universalist perspective, there's reason to celebrate China's rise because it's quite clear that it hasn't involved the same imperial north-south relations that we've seen in the past. China does not have the same desire to impinge on sovereignty of other nations in the south or actually suppress development in the South to the same degree as we've seen that Europe has had and the United States has had and still has, you could argue. So in that sense, it's a good sign that China is rising. It's good, I think, for South-South relations to the degree that we see China as part of the South. And as you said, this is a complicated question. Is China part of the South or not? Technologically, perhaps not, but historically and in terms of emerging from the periphery as a challenge to the North, it is still part of the South. Now here comes the complicated bit. What does, the fact that China is so huge and does all these things, does that crowd out opportunities for other countries in the South to develop, to industrialize, etc.? One, if we look at studies and, cross-country studies and case studies looking at China's involvement directly with other countries in the South, we see that China is more willing to invest in sectors that matter, like manufacturing and also infrastructure development, than traditional sort of development partners in the North, which is unambiguously good. So that is a good thing. And also now we're seeing that China is willing to export clean energy products to many countries in the South. Perhaps there isn't signs yet that technology is being transferred, but you know what? If you are a developing country and you have installed capacity in solar panels, for example, that is much better than being dependent on imports of fossil fuels because it enables some degree of energy sovereignty. So that's also good. Now, there are different sort of elements, geographic elements that we should discuss. In Southeast Asia, we're seeing that already that countries like Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, and Indonesia are benefiting from investments from China and also starting to take over some labor-intensive manufacturing as wages in China start to rise. However, we also hear reports from, for example, countries like Indonesia that it's hard to build, to build up a proper manufacturing base with China essentially doing everything. In Latin America, I've talked to a lot of scholars and also politicians there who say that it's somewhat of a double-edged sword in that China is more willing to respect the sovereignty of nations that, for example, the United States has been, but there is to some degree a greater dependency relationship between China and the South in that Latin America simply end up exporting raw materials to China and importing manufactured products. So I do think we need to keep in mind that if China simply starts manufacturing everything, this will inevitably crowd out some opportunities for industrialization in the South. But I don't think we're at the point where, China's rise has meant that some countries in the South have prematurely deindustrialized. Vietnam is still growing exceptionally fast and industrializing fast, and also connecting, to China through that industrialization. The same can be said to some degree for Cambodia, for Thailand. And, in Africa, positive views of China outweigh negative views by a factor of 3 to 1, according to a recent survey in Asia Policy Institute. And generally, this is a very interesting survey here that I looked at by the Alliance of Democracy, a Danish-based NGO that's led by the former NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen, which found that, 79% of countries around the world have a more favorable view of China than the United States. And almost all these 79% of countries were global South countries. So clearly, China is doing something good in the global South. Yes, there are stories there are negative stories that we need to take seriously, but overall, the story we're seeing of China in the global South is one that is more positive than I would say the last centuries of North-South relations.
I agree. And maybe we could end by asking you about your thoughts on globalization itself. We began with neoliberalism, and of course, that has many components from class war to kind of thinking, etc. But part of it was also globalization. Now, I want to stay with the global south and think about globalization with you from the global south perspective. There are economists like Prabhat Patnaik and others, I think in India, but we get that kind of economist across the global south, which says that reliance on the export market too much is detrimental. And on the face of the tariffs, the sanctions, and now also essentially kind of sanctions on the service sector through H-1B visa, which has affected obviously India enormously. People are rethinking about globalization itself in the global south, even those who were ardent supporters of globalization driven by neoliberalism. So I'm thinking what your thoughts are on people like Prabhat Patnaik's assertion that you cannot base your development on primarily on the export sector. Yes, sometimes you are successful, as in the case of China. He would also say that that has come at the cost of expense of the global south to the extent that it exports deflation. But he comes from an internationalist perspective and says that one country's success comes at the expense of the others. So he would say that we should we should be following a more nationalized economy. That would, of course, means tremendous restructuring of internal policies, because if you have to strengthen the state, for instance, you would have to reduce your dependency on global capital, or else you raise taxes sometimes and the global capital flows out and you cannot rely on the stock market. And this is a problem we are seeing in countries like India. On one hand, there is a lot of hand waving about India standing up to the United States. On the other hand, we are seeing its impact on the stock markets, which is very critical for its overall economy. And it knows that it has to come up with a trade negotiation. It cannot stand up as China does, because Indian stock market is not driven by the tech innovations that we are seeing in China, but it is very much dependent on foreign portfolio investment. And the moment they withdraw, and every time there is uncertainty, they would withdraw. What do you make of this question marks on globalization itself from the global south?
This is really an excellent question, and the way you frame it around development, and should development does it have to entail exporting to markets in the north? And I'm torn here, and I'm probably I probably differ a little bit among many of my colleagues on the left in my views here. And yeah, the view that you are summarizing here is can be called dependency theory, if you will, about achieving sovereign development independent from the North being important. I think I agree with the vision that we are seeing that, especially now, being dependent on exports to the US is proving to be very detrimental in light of what Trump is doing. We've seen in the past how, I mean, we've seen a very clear pattern of globalization and embracing trade uh, simply on the terms of those who have power in the international economic order, or at least in the old Bretton Woods international economic order that, well, that's debatable whether that exists or not still. But we've seen how globalization doesn't lift all boats. At the same time, historically, if we look at processes of rapid development, that's entailed exports from the south to the north. If we look at East Asian development, the Asian tigers first, and then we look at China, it's all entailed export-oriented development. Not only because this, exports is good for making foreign exchange, but when you're managed in the current system to export to higher income markets, that also entails productivity growth, value addition to your products, innovation. Those are related to becoming popular in wealthy countries' markets. So that's kind of what recent history tells us. And I'd be sort of hesitant to advise countries in the South to scrap that agenda or plan in terms of a development strategy. But at the same time, we do need a vision, like dependency theories say, that does not entail always being dependent on markets in the North. And we do need a vision where we have more trade between countries in the global South, and we are starting to see that, especially trade between countries in the South and China here being considered part of the South. And we actually see, and this is something I pointed out in my research, that also trade agreements between countries of similar levels of income tend to be more beneficial for countries that take part in them than these traditional North-South bilateral agreements or agreements within the WTO that have been completely disastrous overall for countries in the global South. So, to the degree we see more regional hubs in the South emerging, to the degree we see more trade within the global South, that is unambiguously good. But we also have to be aware of this historical fact that countries that have managed to develop their economies fast and eliminate poverty in their home countries has also entailed trading with wealthier countries. And some of these countries, like China, have managed to do this, but at the same time uh, embark on a path of sovereign development. It's a very tricky question, and we haven't even talked about the climate dimension, right? We can't keep increasing volumes and volumes and volumes of trade and still take climate change seriously. So we do need to talk more about the consequences of this idolizing and religion of globalization.
I completely agree. Like you, as a student of history, I think that the most spectacular success, when you look at them, they involve some kind of exporting to the global north, and that's not very hard to understand because you get a huge export market, you get a huge demand that boosts your supply side, but also competing in the to the extent that competing in the international market does force you to innovate and become competitive. I do think that's a good strategy because something we don't often talk in the within the left for the global south is the persistence of a lot of uh, unproductive or low productive sectors that gets a lot of state patronage and they remain. I mean, it's strategically good not to talk about them on the left, given the neoclassical ideologues capitalize on these things. But we do see that how unproductive units are just basically bailed out by the state decades after decades, and they become unproductive. And that's a challenge I think the left needs to talk more about. At the same time, I um, do recognize that those kind of examples are cannot be universalized. So a piece of statistics, one of the professors of history, Kenneth Pomeranz, calculates is that if the path that Britain took during the first industrial revolution of exporting textiles had to be taken by China, the whole world had to be clothed 7 times at that point in time. Now, of course, we are not stuck in textiles. We have electronics and autos, and so there is greater value addition, and so there is greater room there. But it is true that what China did or South Korea did cannot be done by everyone at the same time, because the consumption has to go up so much. So that's one set of caveats. I think the other set of caveat has to be that for most countries, it's not just trade. It comes with the investment side of it, and the whole package that has to be promised to for capital to come in. I mean, China was able to bring capital through its productive labor, investment, state investment in infrastructure, etc., etc. But for most countries, it has been about completely deregulating your labor sector, completely resorting to so-called balancing the budget, which is like leaving no room for fiscal deficit, enormously relying on global capital flows. For countries like India has been less devastating because we have been able to bring in portfolio investment. But for a lot of countries, for Africa, which you know far better, has been relying on the Eurobond debt market, and they become absolutely devastating because they become predatory and so on and so forth. So I'm also very suspicious of globalization at the same time when I think about uh, the rest of the world as a whole, and not a unique specific country at one point in time. Maybe I'll give you the final say and we'll wrap it up there.
Yeah, I think actually ending on some more general thoughts on globalization. So I talked a bit about export-led development, but I think ending on some final thoughts on globalization is I think very fitting. Um, as we both agreed, I think, or I believe we agree that for developing countries, participating in international trade has proven to be essential for development. But there is hope, that we can not always has participating in trade is essential for developing, but we've seen time and time again developing countries in the global south liberalize without that yielding results. The reason for this is that oftentimes globalization and those who have created the rules around globalization has been wealthy countries who have benefited from that. This has also been documented in some recent papers, for example, by Jason Hickel and colleagues, who found that through trade, the global north has actually drained a lot of resources and value and money from the south. We see how, the trading system through the WTO, the rules here are rigged in large part in favor of, well, the countries, more specifically corporations based in those countries. Research here by Richard Cosell-Wright and Kevin Gallagher points out that actually most WTO proposals have vastly benefited transnational corporations in wealthy countries more than anyone else. We also see that wealthy countries in international organizations have more power. We know this through lobbying power in the WTO. The IMF itself is set up in a way where countries that basically donate more money and make up a larger share of the world economy have more power within the organization. So I think what I'm getting at here is, if we are able to create an international order that is truly democratic, we will get closer to a system where globalization can benefit more countries. So that means trying to make these existing institutions like the World Bank and the IMF and the WHO try to give countries in the global south a larger voice, but it also means supporting initiatives coming from the south, like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank or the Asian Development Bank, trade agreements such as the African Free Continental Area, which is the biggest free trade agreement in the world right now in terms of number of member countries, organizations such as the BRICS, which represents an alternative bloc. So trying to, for us who are interested in development, supporting and building up initiatives that empower global South countries in international fora will enable globalization to lift more boats. They're not going to be a magic bullet for development everywhere. The world economy is still organized, unfortunately, in a manner where sovereign states compete against one another. China has its interests in the global economy. India has its interest in the global economy. South Africa, Brazil, other two big nations have big interests in the global economy. So we'll still see uneven development outcomes within the global south. It's not going to be kumbaya for everyone, but and I do see signs now with Trump's tariffs and the wrecking ball he's taking to the world economy that we are seeing signs of a new international economic order emerging, where China looks to be leading that can be more global south centric and give a larger voice to countries in the global south in economic and political terms.
That's a very good point to end on. If the international order had been more fairer and equal, then the impact of globalization wouldn't have been what we have seen, or wouldn't have been as uneven as we have seen. We'll leave it there, Professor Haug. This was a wonderful conversation, and it was an honor for me to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was my honor as well.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.